For this episode, I asked Georgina Godwin to interview Amanda Pullinger. Amanda is the CEO of 100 Women in Finance. She's been in that role for more than a decade and a half. During that time, she's taken the organization from being a small group of women in New York called 100 Women in Hedge Funds to an organization that comprises more than 15,000 professionals in 21 locations across 3 continents and is now called 100 Women in Finance and has been responsible for the growing role of women in the finance industry through the extraordinary education and opportunity that it provides for its members. It's also attracted some extraordinary people into the organization. Of particular interest to me was Jane Buchan, who was the CEO of PAMCO, and Ivanka Trump, who joined the board. She's also managed to interest the Prince of Wales, Prince William, in the United Kingdom to become a patron. And so she's done some extraordinary development work there. Before that, she worked with me at Aquamarine. She's an investor with me, and she was also a partner in the business at the time. And we had a great time in New York City for a number of years, working together out of Midtown Manhattan. And I originally met Amanda in Oxford, actually. She was an undergraduate with me at Brasenose College, and it's really been extraordinary to see how Amanda, coming from Birmingham, from an environment that was about as far away from New York City and high finance as you can get, has managed to pull herself up by her own bootstraps, but not with the specific help of anybody. And it's extraordinary that she's now helping women across the planet do the same thing. A lot of the time, I'll leave you with just this thought. Amanda and I see eye to eye on all sorts of things, but there's one thing that we don't see eye to eye on, which Georgina touches on at the end of the interview, in that Amanda and I have diametrically opposing views on Brexit, and you might enjoy that. Politics has never been a part. I've always enjoyed having friendships with people who see things differently, politically and otherwise to me, and that's the case here. I hope you enjoy the interview.
So, Amanda, I'm really keen to get some sense of your early life. Where were you born?
So I was born in Birmingham in the UK, and I was actually the first in my family to go to university. And I often tell this story that, as a young teenage girl, I didn't grow up in a family that had lots of business interests or even knew about people in business. But Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, first female Prime Minister, and she was someone like me who had gone to the local school and she went to Oxford. And obviously she was a woman that was very visible. And I'll talk a bit about visibility and why it's so important for women a bit later. But a woman that I never met influenced, in a sense, my whole life. Because as a young girl, I said, well, if she's got to Oxford, I'll get to Oxford. And so first in my family to go, and I ended up studying modern history at Brasenose College in Oxford. But really thanks to somebody who I never met, but who was visible to me, who I could say, if she can do it, I can do it.
And what about your parents? What did they do? And did they have an equal relationship in terms of a gender balance?
That's a really interesting question. My parents have a wonderful relationship, which I realise now is quite a rarity. They are best friends, and they share everything. So my father was a tax inspector, so a civil servant, and then at age 40, which interestingly was the exact same age I switched from for-profit to non-profit, or not for-profit in his case, but he became a pastor of a church on a full-time basis. My mum was a nurse, qualified as a nurse, but and I've got 2 siblings, and when she was bringing us up, she stayed at home. It was only after we'd all left that she actually ended up working on a project related to AIDS patients in Birmingham. But she basically didn't, she never worked full time once we were all born. But she supported my dad. And it's so interesting because most people think of, oh, he was the pastor of the church and she was the little wife. Well, my mum is not the little wife. My mum has a voice. I mean, people will say they're far more scared of her than they ever were of my father. And so they've always had this very complementary role. And, so my sense growing up was that decisions were made jointly. It was not that my dad was the main decision maker. My mum was absolutely there deciding all of those things. But she had a traditional role from the outside perspective, yeah.
So you mentioned you went to Oxford, and of course Guy Spear went there too, but so did a number of other very well-known people there at the same time. David Cameron, Michael Gove, Boris Johnson. Tell me about that. Did you have much to do with them?
It's really funny because I've met them all since through various meetings, etc. But so I knew David because he was at my college. I didn't know him well. I wouldn't say that he was one of my best friends, and I kind of knew him through Guy and some of the other friends that I had. So I didn't really know. I couldn't say that I knew him terribly well. I actually knew Andy Feldman, who was a very good friend of David and actually obviously became chairman of the Conservative Party. I knew him a little better, but Michael Gove and Boris Johnson, I didn't know. I didn't actually get involved in politics, so really didn't join the union or anything. And it's quite funny now to think that our country is being run by people, the boys that I was at college with, All I ever heard were the stories of, what they got up to at the Bullingdon Club, etc., etc. So I'd heard of Boris because in that context of him knowing David, etc., but I didn't know them personally. Yeah. But it is quite funny that, you recognise, and I've thought about it a lot. I mean, you recognise the power of Oxford. It's interesting. It's Oxford, not Cambridge, in terms of how our government has been run. And if you look, there's only one prime minister, which is Gordon Brown, who went to university, to a university other than Oxford. There are a few that didn't go to university at all, but in the 20th and 21st century, every prime minister has gone to Oxford, which tells you something about the place. So I feel incredibly proud of that. But it is quite funny to think that those boys who got up to all sorts of things are now running the country.
What did you do when you left university?
So I joined an environmental services division of a large group called Ocean Transport and Trading. Subsequently became Corey Environmental, the group I was with. So my first day on the job, I was on a landfill site in a place called Mucking in Essex, where we brought all the domestic waste out of London in containerised barges along the Thames to this landfill site. And I often say that, that first day started a career where I went through 7 different industries, all of which were male-dominated, which is quite funny when you think about what I do today. But so I was a graduate trainee. I worked for 2 years doing a number of different jobs. And then after that 2 years, my boss said, okay, now you need a proper job. What do you want to do? And I said, well, I'd quite like to go to America. And I only said that because they had one subsidiary company that was in America. And I really wanted to get outside of the UK and do something internationally. And so, I was really lucky at 23. I got the opportunity to be transferred to their New Jersey office. And I joined, that's how I moved to America. And the rest, as they say, is history. I've been in the States for 30 years now.
And your start in finance, how did that come about?
Well, that's kind of a long way through the process of my career. So I landed in the US. After 2 years, I ended up getting married to an American, and that obviously enabled me to work for any company I wanted to. So I joined an ad agency in Philadelphia doing market research. I then moved to be the director of a Caterpillar dealership because they said they'd pay for me to do an MBA.
That's a vehicle rather than an insect.
Exactly, yes, the bulldozers, which is a fantastic place to be, obviously very male dominated. And then I went from there to Unisys, where I managed, where I worked for their hardware computing side, and really was a translator between the hardware and the sales and marketing people in terms of translating what clients needed and what the engineers could produce. And then it was the dot-com era, so I ended up in New York, and I worked for 6 months for a dot-com, which then kind of blew up at the end of 1999. And that's when Guy said to me, hey, would you like to come and hang out in the office, see what I do? And he was running a hedge fund at the time. And I knew nothing of the financial industry. And I kind of said to him, well, what do I know about this? And he said, you know what, I want to manage the money. I want to manage the portfolio. I think you can just learn everything else. And so I became a partner with Guy, a principal at Aquamarine Capital. And for 7 years, I managed the marketing, the back office administration, investor relations, office, managed the office. We hired some people. So a very untraditional way of getting into finance, there's no doubt about it. But loved the industry. Obviously, the hedge fund industry was very entrepreneurial at that point, and I loved that kind of aspect of it. And it was through that process that I met or joined what was then 100 Women in Hedge Funds. I joined them very early on. The organization started in 2001. And I became a member in 2002, never thinking that it would become eventually my full-time job.
And I mean, really down to the fact that Guy is pretty far-sighted and somebody that really sees the benefit of having women in the industry. And I wonder why women are underrepresented in finance and why it's so important that isn't perpetuated.
So it's a complicated and long answer. I think that like any industry, if the industry is massively male dominated, it's very hard for women to see. At the beginning, I said I went to Oxford because I saw a woman who had a pathway, who had a similar background to me and had a pathway to get there. I think part of the challenge is that unless you have women who are visible in roles, particularly in investment roles, why would you think that you could do that job, right? I also think there are definitely some cultural issues. It's very interesting to see the difference, for example, between the UK and China in terms of how many women are on the investment side of the business. A lot more in China, because culturally, women manage the money in China. There is no stigma attached to being involved with money management. Culturally in the UK, in the US, and quite frankly anywhere in the West, there's still this stigma to this day about somehow money being dirty and being a man's world. And so I think there are many different reasons why there aren't enough women in the industry, particularly in investment roles. And so there's this kind of self-perpetuation that you don't see any women, and so therefore you go into a different role. So we do see a lot more women in marketing roles and investor relations roles, and I think that's because they see other women in those roles. So why does it matter that we see more women in these, particularly in investment roles in the industry? Well, I believe diversity matters, and all of the studies show that if you come at an investment problem with diverse perspectives, you get better results. Now, I'm not just talking about gender, right? There was a really interesting HBS study Harvard Business Review, study done a couple of years ago. It was on the VC industry, but what they looked at was 20,000 VC deals. And they looked at the composition of the deal team and the results that came out of those deals. Well, it turns out the worst performing deals were deals that were done by people who all went to the same university. The best performing deals were ones where people were ethnically diverse in the team. And I love that example because neither extremes are about gender. Mm-hmm. And I think this is the crux of the situation, that the results around investing are better when you have people thinking about the issues from different perspectives, from different backgrounds. And I do think that women do come at this with a different perspective.
Can I just refer you back to something you said earlier, which was, of course, about the government all being run by the people from the same university? And do you think then that that study actually reflects why things have gone really quite so wrong here in the management level within our country?
Well, I think it does reflect on the fact that you have a very narrow point of view. I'm not going to criticize the government for everything. I think it's a very tough time. I think governments around the world, I would not want to be a politician right now. However, I do think, and here's the challenge with diversity when you're talking about a cabinet being diverse or whatever. Things take longer to resolve, because think about it. It's the difference between going out with your mates and having a conversation about a topic where you all know what each other thinks and how you're going to react, and you kind of come to conclusions really quickly, right? Think about being on a jury and how long it takes even to determine who's going to be the jury foreman, because those people are all coming from different backgrounds, right? They don't know each other. They don't know the perspective. I believe the results are better in the long run, but the challenge we have is we all feel comfortable with people who look like us and who think like us, right? That is the challenge. And frankly, it's the challenge in the industry. We talk a lot about, diversity and this and that and the other. Most financial firms have diversity and inclusion officers. And it still strikes me as odd that institutional investors aren't saying, where are the diverse investment teams from all of these different perspectives? Because either we believe that diversity produces better results or we don't. And I'm not convinced that people really do believe that it matters. In fact, I'd love to do a study at some point where you take two groups, one that's monolithic and one that's very diverse, and give them an investment problem to solve. And I kind of know what's going to happen. The first group is going to come up with a solution very quickly. The second group is going to take its time to establish itself. But at the end, the solution is going to be much more complex, but actually a better solution. Yeah. And I think that's the problem in our society, is we want things done like this, right? We want things done so quickly that's why we revert to hanging out with people who look like us. And I'm going to say one more thing, which is I've gone through my own evolution over the last couple of months. My response to Black Lives Matters was to say, okay, we'll put out a statement at 100 women, right? But actually, I want to do more than that. I want to figure out, how do I take myself out of my comfort zone? How do I connect myself to other networks of women who do come from different backgrounds? So we've actually just collaborated 100 women with a group called Black Women in Asset Management. And I came across that group by being deliberate about looking for people who didn't look like me, who came from different backgrounds. And I think this is going to be a really interesting partnership, because we should know each other. We should know what each other's perspectives are, but we didn't. Now we have the opportunity to come together and have those conversations. But it takes longer, because you've got to build the trust that you automatically have with someone who comes from the same background. So
Let's zone in then on your organisation, 100 Women in Hedge Funds. Tell me exactly what it does.
So we're actually now 100 Women in Finance. We rebranded in 2016 because what we realized was that our membership base was really becoming much broader than hedge funds. And we also wanted to attract more women from a broader spectrum, not just women in the finance industry, but women in finance roles, whether that was in the corporate world or in the public sector. So we're an organization that's almost 20 years old. We have 26 locations across 4 continents. We have close to 20,000 registered members around the world. I have a staff team of 12, and I have about 500 active volunteers who are women and a few men in the industry who volunteer to be on committees to drive our mission. So we have three pillars to our mission. Our overall mission is to empower women in the industry. and in finance roles more generally. But it's also now, we just added to our mission that we want to inspire the next generation of young women, teenage girls, university business school young women, to see this industry as a place that they want to aspire to. And so in terms of the industry focus of what we do, we have 3 pillars. We have education, so we put on webinars, we now put on a lot of webinars or in-person events around business topics. And what we focus on there is really ensuring we love men. Men can become members of the organization. We have male speakers. But what we're really focused on is finding women in the industry and creating visibility for those women. So we really focus on ensuring our panels are diverse and that we feature women who aren't featured in the normal conferences and in the media, etc., to give them more visibility, which I think helps them, but it also helps the next generation. We have peer groups. So at each career stage, we put our members into a peer group. And the reason that that's important is because one of the biggest issues for women in this industry and in any male-dominated industry is that sense of being the only one. And most women are not only the only one in the workplace. If they're a working mother, they're often the only one in their community. That double whammy is psychologically, it's really tough to stay and compete and be in that industry when you feel like you're the only one. So what we're doing is connecting them with other women who may be outside of their firm, who may not even be in the same role as them, so that they can create a peer group that goes with them throughout their career to overcome that sense of being the only one. And then the third thing we do, we call impact, and that is related to our vision of 30 by 40. So what we're saying is we want to see 30% of women on investment teams by 2040, and we want to see 30% of women in senior executive roles across the industry. And we're working towards that with both the empowering of women in the industry, but also building the pipeline. So we're going to be focused on pre-career initiatives, figuring out how we get the role models. You know, my Margaret Thatcher example I use all the time. How do we get those role models into the lives of young women? How do we get them excited about investing when they're 13, 14 years old? How do we change the narrative about the impact you can have in this industry? People often say, oh, it's an industry that's self-serving, it's about making rich people richer. Actually, 80% of the assets are managed for pension funds, for endowments, for foundations. Young women need to know they can make a true difference in the world by being in those investment offices of those particular institutions, making a difference for teachers in terms of how much they get as a pension and how how long that pension's going to last them, frankly. When you tell teenage girls this, it gets them excited because I think they want to feel that they're making a difference in the world. But then they haven't traditionally seen this as a pathway.
Yeah, I am a little bit shocked by that figure that it would only be 30% by 2040. I would have thought that at least one was looking at an equal balance and a lot earlier.
So, a very good question, and we've debated this quite a lot. I like the 20-year rule. I like long-term, and in fact, Guy will appreciate this. Setting long-term goals avoids short-term manipulations. I think this is a generational issue. I think there isn't a pipeline issue, but there is a generational issue in terms of getting enough women excited about investing to really make a difference. But I also think that we as an organization want the time to be able to experiment with different ways of solving this problem. We talked earlier about bringing diverse voices, and sometimes that takes longer. I want to be able to take the moment to say, let's try this, let's try this, let's try this. Let's do it for 3 years. Let's then stop and measure what the impact's been. And let's double down our investment on the areas that have really worked. And so that's why 20 years, because I don't want to have to say, oh, we didn't meet our numbers, whatever. To your second point, why not 50-50? I think for as long as women are the ones that have families, we'll never see 50-50. Because there are some women who will choose not to work. who will choose to raise a family. And I think, we may see more women, more men taking up, some of the role. We certainly are with the next generation. But I wanted a number that sounded realistic, right? 30% sounds realistic. And if you read about 30%, that is the tipping point. That's the point at which we don't need diversity efforts necessarily, because now you've got a third of the room. You are no longer in a place where people are tokens, where they're seen as tokens. Now they've got their people as well. They've got their group that they can really collaborate with. So I believe by setting that goal 20 years from now, we'll get there sooner.
Now, you have a long association with the British royal family who've actually helped you in this goal and trying to see through this initiative. Tell me how that came about.
Oh, it's a funny story. So we, through our impact initiative, which we used to call philanthropy, we raised money at 100 Women through our galas for various causes. And so 11 years ago, or maybe even 12 years ago now, we raised money for an organization called Wellbeing of Women. And it just so happened that Prince William was patron of that organization for that year under the Lord Mayor's appeal. And we ended up being the organization in the UK that raised more money for that appeal than any other organization. And so we were invited to the Guildhall for a dinner, and the chair of the board and myself were introduced to Prince William in a small gathering. And then we sat down to dinner, and the fire alarm went off. And no kidding, we ended up standing next to Prince William and his private secretary at the time, Jamie Lowther-Pinkerton. So Prince William jokes now, at all the galas he's been to with us, he always jokes that you watch out for Amanda and, ringing then the fire alarm, because that's the way she got me. So that conversation ended up in a broader conversation around how we might work together around themes that, at the time, that Prince William cared about, and then it expanded to being the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge and Prince Harry, and the initiatives that they really cared about. And there was a commonality between the kinds of causes we wanted to raise funds for and those causes. So they have, it was 10 years of a partnership. Each of them has attended our London Gala and been an amazing supporter. More recently, Her Royal Highness the Countess of Wessex has become global ambassador for our Next Generation initiatives. So these are our pre-career initiatives, and she's actually a fantastic ambassador. She's gone around the world for us, and she is really focused on figuring out how do we inspire that next generation. So she's done a number of events, including teenage girls. In fact, she hosted one at Buckingham Palace for us earlier this year, just before lockdown, where we had some teenage girls from around the world really talking about how do we inspire them, how do we change this industry. And she's an amazing spokesperson for that. She's increasingly involved in a number of organizations from a gender perspective and changing of the demographics in various areas. So we're really proud to have her involved as well.
Now, you're involved in a number of charitable or volunteering roles, aren't you? Tell us a little bit about your other work.
So ironically, 100 Women in what was then hedge funds was my first non-profit board that I ended up going on, but I've subsequently been on a number of boards in New York and in the UK. I chaired for 4 years the Halo Trusts Board, which is the world's largest humanitarian landmine clearing charity. It's an organization that's near and dear to my heart. I've been to a number of the countries where we're doing work, from Afghanistan to Sri Lanka to Cambodia to Colombia to Zimbabwe. Amazing work they're doing. And so I stepped down from the Halo UK board, but I'm still on the Halo USA board working on their initiatives. I'm also on the National Portrait Gallery board, the American Friends board, which is really, providing American support to the work of the National Portrait Gallery. And I've been on numerous boards, NYU Cancer Institute board for a number of years, and I sit on the Oxford Alumni Board. And I guess I'm also currently president of the Brasenose Society, which is the alumni group for Brasenose. So that all keeps me rather busy.
You've spent more than 30 years in the US. What do you think are the best and worst aspects of the country?
So what I love about America is you can try and fail and people respect you for trying. I think that's the piece that is really amazing, that sense of you can be an entrepreneur and people respect you for trying, which is why I think America has been such a successful place. So I love that element of it. I think the most difficult thing for me about America is that it's not a culture that actually encourages debate in a constructive manner. I mean, if you think about the way that our political systems are set up, I love Prime Minister's Question Time. There's nothing like it in America, right? That idea, and of course it comes from my Oxford education, of that tutorial where you're debating somebody who knows a lot more than you do about a period of history, in my particular case. But, the conversations that I used to have at Oxford and that I have with a lot of my friends outside of the US are much more comfortable conversations where I can take the opposite side from them and know that at the end of it, we're all going to be friends. There is this sense that you have to be part of a team in America, and you have to be loyal to that team and never change. So from a political standpoint, my political views in the US don't fit into one party, and yet there's very little mechanism to have those debates. So that's the bit that I think is really lacking in America. But ultimately, look, I've lived there, and clearly, I particularly love New York. It's an amazing place to live, or it has been. I think COVID has given New York some challenges currently, but I love the big thinking of America. There is definitely the big thinking. It's just the can we just get along and have a debate, and that actually produces better results, and I think that's part of the challenge.
I mean, we're talking just a couple of weeks before the election, and I wonder what you think about how a Biden administration might affect the world of finance and possibly do more than a Trump administration to further increase the role of women.
It's tough for me to talk about this because I think it's unclear. I think it's very unclear how Biden will be supportive of the finance industry. I suspect if he wins, the stock market will take a plunge for starters, because I think that Trump has been. I think Trump, for all that people say about him, he put in place initiatives that enabled the economy to grow, and frankly, it's interesting how well the economy is still doing even with COVID. I know there are large numbers of unemployed, etc. On the issue of women, it's a tough one. Ivanka Trump sat on 100 Women in Finance's board for a number of years. I have huge respect for Ivanka, and I have to believe that she has some influence over her father in terms of, and as a woman, she's certainly pursued. In the past, before she was visible and before politics or whatever, I mean, we saw her in environments where she was incredibly inspirational for the next generation of women, particularly around tech and coming into roles where in industries that were male dominated. So I'm not so sure that Trump has done a terrible thing for women. Nor that he dismisses every woman out there. Look, he's a tough personality and difficult, but equally, I think Biden will have to do will clearly have to put more women in visible roles. But I don't know that just putting women in roles is the answer. I think we need to be recognizing that women with expertise are already out there and making sure that they get those opportunities. Sometimes just having a woman is no better than than sticking a man in a job that he can't do, right? So I think it needs to be a bit more nuanced than that. And I'm sorry, I'm being very vague because I am politically, as I said to you earlier, I don't sit in either bucket very clearly. Frankly, what I would say is the most disappointing thing for me, and it'll be the first time I get to vote as an American citizen this time around, is that we have 2 old men, that our candidate list is 2 old men. And I think that's incredibly disappointing. I think America can do better.
But you have Kamala.
You do. My challenge with Kamala is I don't agree with her politics. And again, as I said, just because she's a woman doesn't mean she's necessarily the right person for the role. I do think, we've got to work. We've got to work on. We've got to work on encouraging more women to go into politics. I think the big challenge, and we've seen it here with Women to Win, which is the Conservative Party thing, there's been some movement. There are more women in the Conservative Party, but frankly, the way that politics is playing out, I mean, who wants to be in politics at all is the big challenge. So we will see. But I'm not even just saying, I want a woman president. I'm saying, how do we end up with a country that's as diverse and massive as America with 2 white men who are over 70 years old? And so we've just got to be much more deliberate about highlighting the opportunities and giving women a pathway through. And I don't think the Democratic or the Republican Party have it right currently.
Let's turn to Britain. I wonder if you think this country punches above its weight, but also if that's going to change if we have a no-deal Brexit.
So Guy and I completely disagree on the whole issue of Brexit. I guess, look, I'm British, and I have an enormous amount of pride in being British. And I also feel like, I was given an opportunity to go to Oxford, which I'm not sure I would have had in other parts of the world. At the time, it was free. It was, it was available to me. I have to say that with all of the traveling that I've done, I do think that Britain has a unique role to play. And part of the reason that I think Brexit might be a good idea is that for the last however many years, we've kind of been tied into Europe and focused on that as our mainstay trading group. And yet, the opportunities for Britain are almost better outside of the EU than they are within the EU. And by that I mean that if you think about certainly the English-speaking world, we have a lot of commonality. In some ways, we have more commonality with Australia, with Canada, with South Africa, with Kenya, with the Cayman Islands, than we do with mainland Europe. Our legal systems, the way that we are educated, the way in some ways we think about the world is actually more similar than the mainstream. And I'm going to use an example which will make Guy laugh, because we were invested in Weetabix. We all know what Weetabix is. Most Americans have no idea what Weetabix is because it is very much a British product. But actually, as it turns out, it's a product that's gone around the Commonwealth. So wherever in the Commonwealth you are, you can buy Weetabix in that country, which is it's a funny thing. Well, guess what? If you go to mainland Europe, They don't know what Weetabix is, because it's very much a tradition that was built in, as part of the way of our culture. And that's a silly example, but I think it does speak to a way of thinking about the world where there is connectivity. So I actually think there's enormous opportunity for the UK to trade. We're the best advertising people in the world. We're creative. We have amazing film and television industry, right? Taking all that to the world, I think there are enormous opportunities, in areas that Britain really, really succeeds. Equally, my hope post-Brexit is that we ensure that the talent that we attract to the UK is global, and that there's no reason why someone from Afghanistan cannot have a job in the finance industry in the UK. Again, going back to diversity, I think the finance industry needs more than just those that are part of the EU in order to succeed. So I'm very hopeful. It's going to be a rocky ride, of course, any changes. But I think if we look back 10 years from now, we'll say, actually, all of the naysayers about becoming Little Britain were wrong, and that actually we did make strides from a global perspective.
You've been so generous with your time. I suppose it's one last question, and it just would be, and obviously you have a lot to say on this, but what would be your advice to a young woman thinking about starting in finance? How would you sum that up?
First of all, it's just get into the game, right? Just get into the game to start with. Join a firm. It almost doesn't matter what firm you join. Start as an analyst. That would be my recommendation. Start as an analyst. That's it's the tough end of the business, but I think it's also the most interesting. And then find a way to get outside of the country in which you were born. Take an international opportunity, because by taking that international opportunity, you will serve your career really well, even if you don't stay there, and even if you come back, because your firm, or whichever firm hires you, will now see you not as a woman in the industry, they'll see you as someone who has international experience. And the third thing is, find your people. Find your peer group, whether it's through 100 Women in Finance or other organizations, because by not feeling like you're the only one, you will succeed in a way that you won't if you try and do it yourself. And I've said it a number of times recently, a problem shared is a problem solved. A problem halved probably is a problem solved too. And that relates to really having people around you that you can talk to about the challenges you are facing and how are they addressing them. So anyway, those are my few different ways of seeing more women stick in this industry, which I think is a fantastic career for a woman. I think it's an amazing career.